My name is Adrian Paul from the SAP Customer Experience Group, and today's webinar is entitled BI 4.1 Installation and Patching, and will be presented to you by my SAP colleague, Harjeet Judge.
Thanks, Adrian, and hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar today. As Adrian mentioned, my name is Harjeet Judge, and I work for the Customer Experience Group. That's a group within the development team. I'm based out of the Vancouver, Canada office, and I've been working with SAP for over 10 years, primarily focused on the Business Objects product portfolio. In the webinar today, I'm going to be covering two topics. I'll start off by providing some tips and tricks and some best practices to help you plan your BI installation. We'll also cover some platform-specific tips for Windows and Linux to really help you build a solid foundation for your BI infrastructure. Then I'll move on to talk about patching, where I'll cover the SAP maintenance strategy, introduce you to some of the tools that are available to help you build your maintenance strategy. I'll also share some patching best practices and introduce you to a parallel patching option that we introduced in BI 4.0 SP5 onwards. There should be plenty of time for QA at the end of the session as well, but like Adrian mentioned, feel free to post your questions in the chat window, and we have some subject matter experts on the call who can potentially help answer those while the presentation is going on. So to get started, let's talk a bit about the products and components that comprise the BI 4 and 4.1 infrastructure. So the BI 4 server has about 13 plus server components and services such as Web Intelligence, Crystal Reports, dashboards, and many of these services are hosted inside the adaptive processing server that we talked about in the previous webinar. We also provide supplementary tools to help administer the products, so things like the Central Configuration Manager, the Server Intelligent Agent, the W-Deploy tool, and also the UMT tool that I'll cover in a bit more detail on the next slide. So it's important to note that the client tool package comes separately from the BI platform installation and contains things like the Webby Rich client, the information design tool, and the report conversion tool. Crystal Reports for Enterprise and Crystal Reports 2011 and 2013 also have separate installation packages. And finally, some Office-based components you might be interested in also come as separate products. So things like Analysis for Office and Live Office also have separate installations. So it's important to plan your environment in advance, because the general guidance that you would get from SAP is that the BI client versions that you have running on your desktops need to match what you have installed on the BI 4 server. So majority of these installers support running the command line install, which you can also utilize to package your client tools and use something like Microsoft SMS to automate the installation of those client tools onto your users' desktops. So as I mentioned before, the UMT tool or the upgrade management tool is something that you install as part of the server installation. And if you're not familiar with this tool, it's used to migrate content from an older business objects environment to BI 4.1. So for example, if you're upgrading from XI 3.1 to BI 4.1, you will use the UMT tool to move your content from XI 3.1 to BI 4. So for best performance with upgrading, the recommendation we generally make is that the UMT box is its own standalone box. But keep in mind that the UMT tool also needs to load certain server plugins in order to process the movement of the content from one environment to another. So you can't just have the UMT tool installed by itself on a box, on a single server box. You also need to select some of the server dependencies that the UMT tool requires for it to function properly. So we document some of these dependencies in a knowledge base that's available online that you can search from the support portal. But my suggestion usually is that if you're setting up a separate UMT box, go in and install the full server components on that machine and just stop the SIA as well as the Tomcat from running on that box and just use that box only for the UMT workflows. Some general platform agnostic tips when you're planning your BI installation. first, I strongly encourage you to refer to the supported platform guide, and that's something you can find on the SAP Service Marketplace. So the supported platform guide basically consists of a PDF document and some supplementary Excel files, which contain things like the supported operating systems, the supported Java application servers, as well as the different clients that are supported with a particular release of the BI platform. So I'm going to try to flip to the bar here so you can actually see what that supported platform guide looks like. Let's see here. I'll try to bring that up. So once you access the Service Marketplace and open up the supported platforms guide, this is what the table of content looks like for that guide. You can just see that it covers quite a wide variety of topics, so I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but I'll just highlight a few points here. So if I go to the next page here, you can see the list of supported operating systems for the BI4 server components. We support various flavors of Windows, Linux, AIX, and Solaris. One point that I want to draw your attention to is if you look at the bottom right-hand side, you can see that the Mobi servers or the mobile servers are not currently supported on the Solaris 11 installation. So if you're looking to install your BI 4.1 on Solaris 11, you need to keep that in mind that the mobile servers are not going to be available on that specific operating system. So it's quite handy that you go through this supported platform guides to get an idea of which products are supported on what operating systems and which Java application server are supported where. I'm just going to flip to the next page on the supported platforms guide. Here you can see the list of the various operating systems that are supported for the client tool installations. So as I mentioned before, the client tool installers have their own installation package, and the server or the operating systems that those client tool packages can be installed on are also different. I'm going to flip through a few more pages. Here you can also see the different operating systems, different Java application servers that are supported with the BI4 platform. By default, when you install BI4, we ship Apache Tomcat 7 with SAP JVM 6 as a default JDK that's used by Tomcat. But if you attended the previous webinar where we talked about some deployment best practices, I had mentioned that we should be looking at potentially updating the JDK that's used by Tomcat to JDK 7. And as you can see from the list of supported application servers and the corresponding JDK, you can see that Java 7 is also supported with Apache Tomcat. So there shouldn't be any issues with you potentially changing the JDK that's being used by Tomcat. That comes with the default installation, but I would normally suggest is that if you are planning to do that, you actually set up a separate Tomcat instance and configure it to use the Java 7 instead of this SAP JVM 6 that comes with the bundled BI4 installation. I'm just going to flip to page 20 here of this PDF document. So here you can find those supplementary Excel files that I talked about that comes with the supported platforms guide. So if you click on these underlying links here, you can download those Excel files for the different connectivity types. So you have an option of downloading the various connectivities that we support through the semantic layer, so essentially the universes. And there's also separate Excel files for connectivity that we support from Crystal Reports for Enterprise as well as Crystal Reports 2013. So if you were to click on these links, it would prompt you to download a set of zip files that contain these Excel documents that show you what connectivities we support. And I'm just going to show you what the semantic layer data source Excel file looks like here. So let me flip to that here. So if you were to download the Excel file that I just mentioned, I'm specifically looking at the semantic layer databases that we support here. You can take a look at the various relational data sources that we support. So on the left-hand side, you can see that starting from the top, we have connectivity to Apache. There's a lot of different generic databases that we also support. And if you kind of look in the middle section, it tells you the different middleware version you need to have installed on your client tools, as well as on the BOE server to be able to support that connectivity option. And if you scroll slightly to the right of this Excel document, we break this down further by the various operating systems that you might be running on, and also do a further breakdown into whether you're using the universes, the classic UNV files, or whether you're using the new semantic layer that's built using the information design tool and using single source universes or multi-source universes. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the presentation here. So you can also see here on the screen the list of minimum hardware recommendations that you need to have to install the BI platform. You can also find this information in the supported platforms guide as well. So keep in mind that these minimum requirements here that you see are for a test or a demo scenario. So in a production type of system, you would likely be scaling up, and these requirements would be much more substantial for a production environment, depending upon how many users you're trying to size that environment for. So a few more tips in planning the installation. A best practice is to configure the database middleware for any external database server prior to performing the installation. So it can be quite painful if you go through the install and find out later that your CMS can't connect to the system database, and that kind of brings into the question the integrity of the install that you've just done. So another helpful tip is to install any language packs that you might require on the front end of the installation. So what this does is it basically builds the web application files with the necessary resource bundles that you require to support that multilingual need for your system. While with later versions of BI 4.1, it's possible to install those additional language packs after the fact or after the initial install is done, but I would still recommend that you actually do that during the initial installation of BI 4.0. So there are a number of installation types that you can leverage to customize the server components. So first is the full installation type that will basically put the entire BI platform stack on the server, along with the Tomcat application server, as well as the embedded system database. You can also do a custom install to make unique the components that you put on the servers. So perhaps you want to set up a box entirely for management here, so where you would only have the CMS and file repository servers, and you don't necessarily want to install the Crystal Reports processing servers or the Webby processing servers on that machine. In that scenario, you can do a custom install and pick and choose the components that you like to install on that specific box. And the final option is what's known as the web tier installation. A web tier installation basically just allows you to add the web application files, also known as the WAR files, to a given server. It also gives you the option to install the embedded Tomcat application server that we ship with the product. And also a point that's likely going to be helpful for customers that are upgrading from XI 3.1. You have the option of installing the BI4 server as well as the client and do a side-by-side install. And what that means is if you have an XI 3.1 environment or client tools or server already running, you can also install the BI4 installation on the same machine. Just a few things that you want to keep in mind is while we support the side-by-side install, the BI4 installation may or may not be supported on the operating system or the hardware that you're using for your XI 3.1 installation. And also keep in mind that the minimum supported hardware or minimum requirements for BI 4.1 installation are generally higher than what you would see with XI 3.1. So yeah, even though you might be on a supported operating system, you may not meet those minimum requirements, and in those scenarios, you don't necessarily want to be doing a side-by-side install on an existing XI 3.1 installation. A few additional tips. Just make sure you take a note of the CMS cluster key, and that's something you would specify when you're doing the installation. So the CMS cluster key is something we use to encrypt the content that's stored in the basically the CMS database. And you also want to make note of some of the user IDs and passwords that you defined for the administrator account, as well as the system database, the passwords that you may need for the subversion, as well as the version management applications that we also install during the installation of the product. So for some reason you do forget the CMS cluster key, it would make it very difficult for you to then either add an additional node or change the CMS system database connection or update that system database connection. So make sure, if anything, you should, at the very minimum, be taking a note of the CMS cluster key. So also when you're installing on Windows or Linux platform, you want to keep the installation path as simple as possible. We don't want things like unnecessary spaces or special characters, so things like dots or anything like that in the installation path. And it's also better to keep the installation path as small as possible. So rather than using the default installation directory that the product installs to, you can create a folder under the root drive, for example, something under the C drive called SAP BusinessObjects, and do the installation under that folder rather than doing the install under the default folders that the installation will select. So let's talk about some platform-specific requirements. So we'll start with Windows. First, when you're installing on Windows, you need to have the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 or higher installed. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that it's also a good idea to disable the antivirus software while you're doing the installation. So just based on some experience of the past, if you have the antivirus software running in your environment, you could see the installation time go up substantially. It could be as much as 4, 5, and even as high as 10 times when you have the software running. And the reason for that is because when you do the installation, the antivirus software is basically scanning the thousands of files we're writing to the system, and that substantially slows down the performance of the install. So save your headache and just turn that antivirus off for the duration of the install that you're running. So again, like I mentioned, it's something that you can enable after the fact, after the installation is done. You should also disable the firewall temporarily as well. The firewall can prevent, for example, the CMS from communicating with the system database, or for a web processing server to register with the system database, especially if you're doing multi-node installations. And finally, the installation user should be a member of the administrator group. So we do a lot of reads and writes to the system registry as well as to the Windows system folder. And having an administrator user just ensures that you don't run into any permissions problems during the install. In cases where you're not a user, or if the user that's doing the install is not a member of the local admin group, it's sometimes possible that the installation may go through successfully, but you may start to see unexpected results when you actually attempt to use the software after the fact. So just avoid the headache and follow these steps. Disable the antivirus software, use the local administrator user ID to do the installation of the BI4 product. So let's talk about some of the Unix and Linux specific tips. These are covered at length in the install guide and also the BI pattern books that are also available online. You can see the list of utilities that must be used or must be installed on those Linux or Unix machines. I'm not going to go through all of the utilities. You can look at those at your own leisure. Oftentimes you'll find that these utilities are available on the system, but the user ID that you're using to run the installation either doesn't have access to those utilities, or they don't have the path variable defined to specify where you can find those utilities or where those utilities are available to run from. So go in and update the path variable for the user that's going to be doing the install, so they have access to these utilities, and make sure they have execution permissions to run these specific utilities when the installation is happening. Just a few other things here. It's also important to set the locale prior to running the installation script, or the installer will actually complain. Some examples of how you can set this on different Unix versions is listed here, but generally you would be using something like export lang equals en_us.utfa. That's sort of the standard syntax, but it may look different depending on the different version of Unix that you're using. Another tip is that you don't want to be using the root user for running the install. Even if you decide to do a system installation of the BI4 system, you would generally use a specific user to run the installation, and then you can use a root user to register the startup script so at the various run levels. And finally, ulimits are something you would want to set to unlimited as well for the specific user that's running the installation, as well as the user that's going to be running the product afterwards as well. The ulimits are things like the number of open files, number of open file handles, and things of that nature. You want to make sure those are set to unlimited for the user that's installing the product and the one that's going to be used to start up the server intelligent agent after the installation is done. So just a couple more points specifically around Linux and Linux. In the BI 4.1 release, we started shipping the Sybase SQL Anywhere database as a default embedded database for CMS as well as for audit. This is a change from BI 4.0, where we actually installed a DB2 database for the CMS. So if you're doing a default installation of BI 4.1, and the installer will install the SQL Anywhere drivers for you. But in a clustered environment where you may be setting up another CMS node, you will need to go to the Service Marketplace and download the Sybase Anywhere database client, and also ensure that the ODBC connectivity is defined correctly to where you have the actual CMS database running, and before you run the installation. Just finally, just a few notes around the kernel parameters specifically for the SUSE Linux environment. These are some things you should set on the SUSE Linux environment to make sure your database setup happens properly. And just to close off the installation discussion, here are some helpful resources you can use to plan your installation, specifically the BI pattern books that I talked about earlier. Cover a complete, and they provide a very complete and comprehensive installation for Windows as well as Linux. So make sure you actually follow the BI pattern book if you're doing an installation on a Linux or a Windows environment. But there's also additional resources such as the installation guide for both Unix and Windows that you can leverage to get additional insight into installing the product. So I'm going to move on to our patching discussion here. So first of all, I'd like just to start out by acknowledging that keeping your software up to date can be quite a difficult task, but it's very important that you stay up to date with the latest maintenance corrections so you can take advantage of the latest fixes that we introduce in the later support packs as well as patches, but also the new innovations that we provide or new features that we provide in those later service packs that we make available to you. So stay up to date on your maintenance. First, let's talk about some of the goals of the SAP's maintenance strategy. In the past, with XI 3.1 or XIR2 releases, we were using a different set of terminology. So most of you might be familiar with things like limited availability fixes or LA fixes as they were called, or fixed packs and service packs. With BI4, what we did was we wanted to align with the SAP terminology, so it makes sense to everyone whether you're using SAP BI Platform or SAP NetViewer or any of the other various solutions that we provide. The terminology that we use for the maintenance is consistent across the board. And finally, in terms of delivering the critical corrections, the experience with BI 4.0 when it was first released was that we were putting a very large number of fixes in a critical patch. Sometimes it could be as high as 50 to 70 patches in a critical patch. And it became very difficult for us to do regression testing and capture any problems that may come up. So SAP's target is to release no more than 20 or so fixes in a critical patch, just to give you that confidence that you can take on that patch and apply it into your system without experiencing any regressions. So let's talk about a few resources that are available to you. So first, on the SAP Marketplace, you can take a look at the maintenance release schedule that's available there. And this is something that we regularly provide 6 months in advance. And it should allow you to plan for resources that you require to prepare for your next upgrade. You basically get the calendar week and the quarter that a maintenance or a support pack is expected to be released, and that way you can plan upfront for those resources that you may require. So you'll also, on this page, be able to find the forward fit plans, and I'll talk more about that in a minute here, but effectively what a forward fit plan does is basically enables you with the knowledge that you require to determine if a fixed pack that is available in one stream, let's say BI 4.1 SP2, is also available in a later support pack, so for example support pack 3. So this just ensures that you don't lose track of the critical patches that you may require when you're planning your upgrade. So I'm just going to flip over to the maintenance release schedule so you can take a look at what it looks like. Apologies, folks. I've got a few screens open here, so I might have to go back a couple of times. All right, so once you access the maintenance release schedule on the Service Marketplace, this is essentially what it looks like. So some of the stuff that you see in orange is basically our patches, and anything that's red is covering the support packs. So if you were interested in finding out when we're releasing support pack or patch 3.5 for BI 4.1, you can see that it's scheduled to be released in week 36. So essentially what this is doing is I'm telling you which week that patch is coming out. So week 36 is basically this week. So you'll be able to see that. So it gives you an idea of when the patch is going to be coming out, and you can plan your maintenance around that. If I were to go to the next page of this document here, let's say you were interested in finding out when support pack 5 is coming out for BI 4.1, you can see that that's currently scheduled for calendar week 47, which is sometime in November. And if I'm not mistaken, that translates to the week of November 17th for the release of support pack 5. Flipping back to the presentation here again. Just some details around the forward fit plan, and I'll do a demo for you here in a few minutes here. But effectively, you can see that the table format of this Excel sheet, and the fact that it gives you the major release or the minor release, and we'll have a different tab depending upon whether you're on BI 4.0 or 4.1, as well as where the release contains fixes from. So the example that I'll draw your attention to is if you look at BI 4.0 support pack 7, we can see that it contains all of the fixes from support pack 6, patches 6.1 and 6.2, and some patches through the later release cycles of SP5 and SP4. So the forward fit plan is a great resource because you don't want to upgrade first and then find out later that some of the critical patches that you require are actually missing from the release that you just installed on your system. A new change that we introduced in an effort to improve our product quality as of SP6 are improving our overall patch-to-patch forward fitting process. So you can see that as of SP6, our newest releases now quickly and automatically receive fixes from all the prior releases as well. So one caveat to this is that if the release dates for the two releases are too close together, there may be chance that some of the fixes are not available in the immediate next release, but we will normally catch that on the next release cycle. So make use of the forward fit plan, like I mentioned before, to understand exactly which patches or which fixes are included in in a specific support pack or a patch that you're looking to install on your system. So now I want to put some things into practice here. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'll walk you through the first one to show you how you can leverage some of the tools that I just talked about to build your maintenance strategy. So let's imagine we have a customer who's currently running BI 4.0 patch 6.5, and they're dependent on using Crystal reports and dashboards for their business. And maybe they've talked to our AGS department and found a problem that's scheduled to be fixed in BI 4.1 patch 1.1, and that fix for that specific issue plus any additional enhancements they're looking to get for that we release with BI 4.1 patch 1 entices this customer to upgrade to that later release. So we want to make a determination whether the patches that or the fixes that this customer is relying on are actually available in BI 4.1 patch 1.1. So I'm going to toggle over to look at the release notes here. All right. So what I'm looking at here is the release notes for BI 4.1 SP1. So what I'm centered in is on patch 1.1. So here you can take a look at the various patches and the different product areas and the fixes that we've done for those specific product areas. So we made a nice enhancements to the release notes about a few months back, where in the past, if you were doing 40 or 50 fixes in a specific patch, all of those patches were bundled into a single category. We didn't actually break them down by the specific product version. So it made it very difficult for you to understand whether a particular patch was going to impact your environment based on what reports or what reporting technology you were using in your environment. So that was a nice enhancement that we did. So you can see the breakdown by dashboards being that's one of the components that our example customer is dependent on. They can easily see which fixes were specifically done in patch 1.1 for the dashboard design tool. And you can also see the same thing for SAP Crystal Reports 2011, and you can also take a look at the different adapts or different fixes that were done to address any problems with Crystal Reports in patch 1.1. So if you were to go through the patch release notes and you see a slew of fixes that we've done for a specific component, that just gives you an idea of the potential risk of taking on that new patch. And in that situation, you may decide that you want to maybe wait for that fix to be included in a support pack before you upgrade your environment. So that and support packs by default generally receive better testing, and they're better tested in general. So you may be more comfortable with taking a support pack rather than a patch if you see a whole bunch of fixes for a specific component that you may be using in an environment. Okay. For this example, we're specifically interested in seeing if patch 6.5 is automatically forward fitted to BI 4.1 SP 1.1. So to do that, to verify that, we can toggle over to the forward fit plan. And here you can take a look at the forward fit plan for patch 4.1, and you can see that we're including several fixes. But if you look at the bottom here, you can see that it does not include patch 6.5. So it's only including patches 6.3 and 6.4. And if you remember our example, the example customer that we were working with was on patch 6.5. So if they were to upgrade to patch 1.1, they would lose all the fixes that were done in patch 6.5. While that may be unfortunate for this example customer, but at least it gives the customer something to go back to their management or go to their user base with and say that we can't upgrade at this point. We'll have to wait for patch 1.2 to come be available before we can install or before we can upgrade. I'll switch back to my presentation here again. So I have another example here as well, and I would encourage you to use the same resources that I just used to see if if it makes sense for the customer example 2 here to also upgrade to BI 4.1, patch 1.1. So let's summarize. When you're building your own maintenance strategy, here's a checklist that you can keep to keep yourself up to date. It's important to track the list of adapts or problem reports, and this is a number that you would get from our active support, global support team while you're during the course of an investigation of a specific message. You'll want to identify the issues that require you to install the next critical patch, for example, patch 1.1, and start planning in advance using the release timelines for that next available support pack to be available. And finally, it's critical to have a test environment that you can use to test these patches before rolling into a development or a production environment. So fortunately, with the benefits of virtualization, this task is quite trivial because you can easily bring up a VM machine where you can run these installation or test these patches in that environment. Some do's and don'ts or some things that you would want to avoid would be to install every critical patch or to take on a patch without any business need. Remember, the critical corrections are there to really support our customers and deliver any mission critical fixes that those customers may need. So you don't necessarily want to take any patches that we release without any specific business need. While it's okay to go and install that, you still have to go in and do your testing and make sure you don't break something in your environment. So we normally don't recommend that you install every critical patch. Having said that, you also don't want to be too far out of maintenance in terms of installing later support packs or patches in your environment. So try not to go 6 months without at least evaluating a maintenance release. So SAP's supportability is to write code fixes for the latest support pack and the latest support pack -1, so the one before that. And if you get too out of date, it takes a maintenance approach and turns that into more of an upgrade. And finally, don't wait until the end of the mainstream maintenance to begin planning your next upgrade. At that point, your hand is going to be forced. So instead, try to plan 6 months in advance to know which candidate fix you might be taking on in the future. So let's talk about some of the best practices for Windows. So it's not just for Windows, we're applying patches for maintenance collections for both Windows and Linux. So first, for Windows, we generally recommend that you take a full server backup, and this is just primarily to safeguard against registry or file system modifications that happen during the installation of a patch. Fortunately, if you have a virtual machine, you should be able to easily accomplish that by just taking a snapshot of that virtual machine before going in to run that patch or a support pack installation. For Unix and Linux environments, you just need to back up the user's home folder and the product installation location. For both operating systems, take a backup of the FRS root directory as well as the CMS and audit database. So if your CMS and audit database is actually sitting on a third-party database, this is likely something that's already taken care of by the DBAs for that system or the backups that those database vendors support. And finally, any custom configurations that you might use. So for example, the branding bundles that you can use to customize the look and feel of BI Launchpad. Ensure you have a backup of those cascading style sheets. And in terms of an update install, so for example, going from BI 4 to BI 4.1, try to leverage the update installer where possible, but keep in mind that we often provide full installs for net new installations as well. So use the support pack release notes that we talked about to ensure that you got custom instructions for anything that you might need to take, place during an upgrade, and for a comprehensive list of fixes that are included in that later support pack. And finally, it's better for performance reasons, to simply turn off all servers except the central management server, the file repository server, and the web application server. this is just basically to prevent any kind of scheduled jobs from kicking off while you're running the installation of the product. So a few other things that you talk about here, you can use utilities like Process Explorer and a Task Manager, or utilities like Process Explorer, Task Manager. If you're on a Unix environment, you can also use stop to determine if the processes, the BOE processes, are actually stopped correctly. In the past with BI4, SP4, we had a few issues where some of the Java processes were locked, and even though you would issue the command to stop the services, those processes actually never get stopped in the system. So use utilities like Task Manager or Process Explorer or Top to kill those Java processes or any lingering BI4 processes that don't get stopped properly after you've issued the stop command, stop server command. Okay, so let's talk a bit about what we are now calling parallel patching. We all know that in a multi-node environment, when you're patching, the process can be quite time-consuming. But prior to BI 4.0 SP5, it was actually even more painful. So if you look at this example here, we have essentially 2 CMS nodes in this cluster here, and then we have 7 other nodes that are the processing tier and the web intelligence or the web application tier. If you were to do an installation of a patch on this environment prior to BI 4.SP5, you essentially had to go in and install the patch on each individual machine sequentially. So for a patch that could take anywhere from 3 to 2 hours, you could be looking at upwards of 14 hours to do an installation of a patch on this environment here. So some symptoms of failures that you would see if you were to run these patches all in parallel in an environment like this is that you would see error messages when you try to access the environment. So if you were to access the CMC and look at some of the server settings or some of the configuration there, you'll start to get error messages there. Another symptom of the problem is you'll start to see a bunch of files being left over in the packages temp folder after the patch installation is done. And that's an indication to you that some of the installation didn't go through properly. And you may also see a bunch of error messages in the setup engine log file showing failures for the CMS to start up correctly. So that was a scenario if you were to do parallel patching in BI 4.0 prior to BI 4.0 SP5. Okay. So let's talk about the parallel patching, and this should save you a lot of time if you're patching in a multi-node environment. So basically what this allows you to do is update your CMS machines in parallel. So in this case, you still have that 7-server cluster here where you have 2 CMS's machine and you have 5 other nodes, 3 being the processing tier and 2 being the web tiers. So with parallel patching that we introduced with BI 4.0 SP5 or later, what you can do is you can run the installation in parallel on the 2 CMS machines. And then once those CMS machines are patched, you can then run the installer in parallel on the other nodes that you have in your environment. So essentially it takes that 7-step process that you had before in the previous slide and turns it into a 2-step process. So this should significantly reduce the time that it takes to patch your environment after 4.0 SP5. And especially if you're trying to do this in a production environment, it should really minimize the amount of downtime that you need to take to install a patch. So let's talk about a few of the rules for parallel patching. So it's important for you to wait for all the machines that are being patched in parallel to finish. We want to ensure that we don't restart any host machines until all the parallel patching process is complete. So it's important that you always have one CMS running, because parallel patching, when you're installing a patch on another node, it will actually try to log into the CMS to authenticate before you can even run the installation. And if any of the other CMSs do start up, let's say you have some monitoring script in your environment that kicks off the startup of the CMS, don't worry about it. Just leave that CMS up and running, because it may be processing requests that are coming to it. And finally, once the update is complete, restart your CMS servers and the other nodes that you have in your environment, just to make sure everything starts up correctly. A new resource that we introduced a few months back, which is also something that's available on SCN. It can help you plan your patching up, help you plan your patch installation on a specific environment. So what this resource is essentially a design studio application, and it takes a number of inputs from around where your cluster is being upgraded from and what patch level you're upgrading to, how many CMSs you have in the cluster, and a number of other components that it takes, so a number of other inputs that it takes. And what it will basically do is once you add in all of that information or input all of that information, it will basically spit out a nice flow chart for you to follow to plan or do the installation of the patch in your environment. So this tool doesn't currently take into account parallel patching, but that's not really a big deal, because if you follow the overall process flow, you can very easily integrate the fundamentals of parallel patching that I've just taken you through earlier. So to close it all off, I'll just leave you with a few reference slides where you can find more information about patches, and where you can find patch release notes and things of that nature, including the forward fit plans. And I think that's all I had. I think we'll move on to the QA section.
Thanks a lot, Ajit. We do have some questions, and thanks also to others on the call who have responded, Tammy, Anand, and John already. So first of all, we did have a question from Anand, which is, what is the purpose of creating an ODBC DSN to connect to SQL Anywhere in 4.1? In 4.0, ODBC was not required. Sure.
Yeah, so one thing we did was with 4.0, we've changed the database that we're using, the underlying database. So as I mentioned, in the past, we were using DB2 database as a default database for BI 4.0. With the BI 4.1, we installed the Sybase SQL Anywhere database. And for you to be able to connect to that database, you need to have obviously the ODBC drivers, as well as a DSN created to connect to that database. So like I was mentioning before, if you were to just run the default installation of a product, or if you were doing a net new install of the product, you don't have to worry about creating the DSN, or you don't have to worry about installing that database drivers, because the install will do that for you. But imagine if you were going in and configuring another CMS node where you wanted to bring another machine up, and so you can't have the database drivers and a separate CMS database for the new node, because you want to be able to cluster those two CMSs together. In that scenario, you would need to download the Sybase SQL Anywhere client on that second node, install it, and configure the ODBC drivers to point to the system database that's on your first node that you set up. And that essentially lets the CMS from the second machine talk to the CMS database that's hosted on a different box. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from John Clark, may have been answered by Tammy already. It says, forward fit information will not be maintained for releases after July 18th, 2014. How do we get information for releases after that point?
One way you can do that is just log a support ticket as well with SAP, and we can provide that information. Another resource is to go through SCN as well and post your question there, and the various members that are part of the community can address that from there.
Okay, thank you. And from T. Holbrook, where is the patch notes PDF located in the support portal? I don't know if that you can answer that specifically.
So if you go to the service.sap.com, you can actually find the release notes on the service marketplace. I'll have to dig them up for you myself as well. I had them downloaded onto my client machine before, but they are available on the service marketplace. And if you also go to like the support portal, or you can search for whatever patch that you're interested in and release notes, and it should bring up what you'll see is a KBase that's created for that specific patch release. And in that KBase, you'll have a link to click on and download the release notes for that specific patch.
Thank you. And from Hamidullah, do we need to decluster the environment before any update?
Absolutely not. No, you definitely don't need to do that. So if you're in a clustered environment, like I was saying before, if you're using parallel patching, you may have 2 CMS nodes. You have, say, 3 or 4 other nodes in your environment that are for processing. You would patch the CMS servers first, and then you can do the installation in parallel on the other nodes that you have in your environment, but you definitely don't have to decluster. That's a lot of work to just install a patch.
Okay. Thank you. And from Hamidullah again, will future forthcoming service packs contain all previous patches, hot fixes, etc.?
Yeah, so that's where the forward fit plan comes in handy as well. So depending on which path that you want to take on, you should really be looking at the forward fit plan to make sure whatever fix you're taking on includes the previous patches on the system, and it provides a lot of detail on what's available in that specific patch that you're taking on. I gave you one example where that may or may not be the case if a support pack and a specific patch are released very close together. We may not have the necessary time to incorporate all of the fixes in that support pack. So in that case, you would find that those fixes that came on us in that patch would be on support pack patch 1 that we released for that later support pack that we make available.
Okay, thank you. And for a question from Jay Riddle, when you say don't reboot until all parallel patching is completed, does that mean just the CMS servers in a cluster or everything, all? I.e., can I run the install on CMS 1 and CMS 2, wait for both to finish, reboot them, then start parallel install on processing 1 and 2, or do I do CMS 1 and 2, processing 1 and 2, then reboot?
Yeah, so Jay, in this case, what you would do is you would go do the parallel patching on CMS 1, CMS 2, reboot those 2 machines, wait for those to come back up, and then you can do your parallel patching on the other nodes in your environment once those other nodes are fully patched, and you need to make sure that the patching process is finished on all of those other nodes as well before you can reboot those other processing tier machines that you have.
Okay, and a question from Anand. Why is MaxDB not supported in SAP Data Services?
That's not a question that I can answer. I don't know why it's not supported. I wasn't even aware that it's not supported for data services.
Okay, thank you. And for a question from T. Holbrook, are there patch documents similar to the ones shown here today for data services as well?
I assume we have something similar, but I'm not a data services person. Maybe something I can take offline, and we can, if you can email me, I can get back to you on that to see if we have something similar available for data services. I assume we would have something.
Yeah, and the email address for Harjeet would be harjeet.judge@sap.com. Thank you for volunteering that, Harjeet. So another question from someone with just a phone number. Are there any plans to make the performance of the audit database better? We had an issue where millions of audit entries were generated, which caused a major performance issue with the CMS. In the end, we had to truncate the ADS_event and ADS event details table to get the system stabilized.
Yeah, so generally, you have the ability to control how much information you're auditing from the CMC. So that's one way you can control that. So the way you want to improve the performance of the audit database is really to control the size of the audit database, and there's a couple of parameters that help you configure that. One is, like I mentioned, you can determine which events you want to audit. And also there's a parameter in the CMC under the auditing application section where you can tell it on how long you want to store the audit information in your system. And by default, I think that parameter is set to something like 365 days or so. So it's quite a large number. And you may or may not need all of that audit information in your environment that you're actively using for reporting as well, right? So what you can do is you can reduce that parameter to a smaller value. So maybe you only keep 30 days worth of data in the audit database, and then if you have other needs or if you have reporting needs for anything longer, you can archive that data and move it to a different database.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Hamidullah. Is it possible to update CMS1, Processing 1, and Web 1, and the CMS2, Processing 2, and Web 2?
Yes, it is. Well, I would recommend that you don't do that, especially if you're going to be doing parallel patching. You would always update CMS1, or you can do update CMS1, CMS2 in parallel. Then you would do Processing 1, Processing 2, Web 1, and Web 2 in parallel. So essentially 2 steps. That's assuming if you're on 4.0 SP5 and higher. If you're not on 4.0 SP5, or if you're an older version, you would still want to do the CMS machines first. I would do CMS1 first, then move on to CMS2, then Processing 1, Processing 2, Web 1, Web 2. So you would have 6-step process in that case.
Okay, thank you, Haji. I think that's all the outstanding questions at the moment. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. So I want to thank everyone for their attendance, and thank you very much, Haji, for presenting. And we look forward to having you at upcoming webinars.
Okay, thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.